Hi, everyone. I'm the host of two crypto podcasts, Unchained and Unconfirmed. I am a journalist who's been covering crypto for 5 years, actually. It's literally my 5 year anniversary, maybe about last month. And the two guests that we have today are two people that are going to be discussing a topic that's actually a little bit controversial and yet at the same time quite of the moment, I would say, given what's going on with the pandemic and some of the quantitative easing that we've seen in response to the shutdowns. And here to discuss are Jameson Lopp, who's the co-founder and CTO of Casa, and Matt Luongo, the founder and CEO of Keep. Welcome, Jameson and Matt. So the three of us know each other from the crypto space, but I wonder if, perhaps maybe a few of these attendees at this conference are from outside the crypto world. So why don't we start with a brief description of your companies and what you do in the space? Jameson, do you want to begin?
Sure. So I recently passed my 5 year mark full-time in the Bitcoin space as well. I've been focusing on security, and really what we do at Casa is we help people empower themselves. We help them to actually attain the promise that Bitcoin has made for a decade, which is that you can be your own bank. Unfortunately, what I've learned in the 5 years that I've been working in the space is that it is incredibly difficult to do that. And what we're doing is we're building technology that is leveraging a lot of security aspects and best practices that we've learned through a lot of hard lessons over the years and putting a really nice user interface on top of it so that we're drastically reducing the technical requirements in order to build a what I call better than bank grade vault.
And Matt, I think when I introduced you, I said Keep, but I meant thesis. So I'm sorry.
Okay, it's brand new
You
right
have
now.
your hands in multiple different things in Bitcoin and crypto. So why don't you explain that for everybody?
Yeah, sure. So I just got my 6 year chip. I started in the space launching a company called Fold. And eventually I started working more on the deeper engineering side, launching another project called Keep. We put all of this under one umbrella, which is Thesis, a production studio. But basically what brings me to space and what we're working on is empowering individuals. So that means a wide variety of things. Most relevant to this conversation, it means empowering them to opt out of our economy, opt out of central planning, opt out of the Fed. But it also means escaping surveillance capitalism and really just, moving to a social model where people need to say yes before they're taken advantage of and signed up for something. So high level, that's what the sort of projects we're working on in Thesis. And then relevant to this, we've recently launched a Bitcoin to Ethereum bridge. And so I think I've got kind of an interesting take on money versus technology in the space and what I think Bitcoin can do post-COVID.
So to kick off our discussion, I actually just want to parse the title of this fireside chat. And let's just start with the beginning, monetary maximalism. How do you guys define that?
Well, really, when we're talking about money, we're talking about a network, a means by which you can transfer value or say, who owes who what within a given society or ecosystem. And, one of the results of networks is that their utility increases as the size of the network grows. So there is a general thesis that we see, not only in finance, but in technology in general, that, we want to see a given technology grow and expand to the point that it becomes the primary network through which people are using that technology, rather than having a fragmented series of many smaller networks that in aggregate are probably of lower total value. So the same thing is what is going to happen with money, we believe, as money becomes more competitive. To this point, for the past several hundred, if not 1,000 years, money has mostly been based upon nation states or regions of nation states that come together. So I think it's a really interesting question when we try to say, well, now that we can transcend the need for money to be created and maintained by nation states and central banks, how might that change the global landscape of money as we know it?
And Matt, how would you describe it?
Well, I don't want to repeat Jameson at all here. So I think big picture, I agree. And smaller picture, as it like pertains to this moment in history, I see this as a clash of visions. I think monetary maximalism is an opportunity to say maybe this is actually the most important thing that we're dealing with right now, like underneath all of the social issues. And yeah, I mean, I think one way to look at this is Metcalfe's law. One way to look at this is networks, but another way is giving people a hard money alternative. And I think that that's what people are going to choose if you have an option between money that's being debased actively and something that you can be confident of in your wallet.
And actually, Matt, I also want to flag an essay that you wrote called Monetary, in which what you called monetary in which you called yourself a monetary maximalist.
Yep.
And there you said, quote, Bitcoin, the asset, offers the best alternative to central banks, regardless of the success of Bitcoin, the technology. And so the way that I interpreted that, and just correct me if I'm wrong, is I thought you were saying that you believed some form of money would become the end-all be-all form of money, but you didn't know if it would be Bitcoin, but you hoped it would be. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah. So I think I would say I agree that there will be one. I think that there's no reason for there to not be many small assets. Stocks won't go away just because one form of money wins. Like there will always be a wide variety of assets, but I do think that it makes sense for there to be one winner in the space of money, and that's been USD for a long time. And I think that, as far as the cryptocurrency space goes, the only thing that makes sense that we're doing to me right now is replacing central banking. Like everything else is a smaller goal to that. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, actually, I want to parse out maybe some of the different things there because,
Sure.
and Jameson, I feel like was maybe going to a more comprehensive view of monetary maximalism where, so I, and I didn't make this up, you guys. I just read this, but someone was saying weak monetary maximalism is just saying there will be one cryptocurrency, or that at least one will gain adoption at a scale orders of magnitude larger than the others. And I think that's what Matt was saying when he was like, it will be something like USD, which of course there's a ton of other currencies out there, but there is only one kind of global reserve currency at the moment. But then it sort of seemed the way Jameson was going, and again, Jameson, correct me if I'm wrong, is that where you were going is to say that cryptocurrency networks will even replace banks and other kind of fiat-based financial systems, not just the assets. Is that what you think will happen?
From a competitive standpoint, I think that these type of networks are going to be able to outcompete banks, at least banks as we know it today. At the very least, I think banks will have to start offering more interesting services. And so, banks will probably get better as well. But I think an interesting question from all of this, when we're trying to say, does this mean that there's only going to be one dominant currency or will there be many? There is this other theory, which I think is interesting to ask Matt about, which is that, perhaps there will be thousands of different digital currencies that are very similar to Bitcoin, Ethereum, and so on, and that it won't really matter which ones you're using because we will build the technological bridges that make it very easy to send your local digital currency and have it end up in whatever the target recipient's digital currency that they want is. Now, will that change the landscape to make it so that it doesn't really matter if we have one? Perhaps, but then on the flip side, you then have to ask yourself, well, does that mean that people will actually prefer to store the, maximalist store of value currency because then they will be able to send, whatever they want and, have it end up in whatever target digital currency at the other end. Some interesting trade-offs and, economic and philosophical questions around all that.
Yeah,
Matt,
I mean,
what do you think?
Well, as far as bridging, and I mean, just to address your question earlier, Laura, I actually do believe in strong monetary maximalism. It's just not my jam right now. And the reason for that is that I'm a pragmatist, and I think that it is going to take us a long time to really ultimately see the end game for Bitcoin. And so that's why I'm so focused on kind of getting the crypto space all aligned together behind one asset. But to Jameson's point, absolutely. I think that on all of these new platforms that are launched, and Ethereum obviously is relevant, but those that get launched after as well, giving people an option to get back to hard money and to get back to Bitcoin really means that any other assets that are trying to compete on that platform need to have a differentiator. There needs to be a reason for them to exist, because copying Bitcoin's narrative isn't enough. Copying Bitcoin's technology hasn't been enough since 2014, but now copying the narrative is not enough either. So I do think that this, there are a couple ways that bridges could work out, but ultimately I think what's going to happen is we're going to have Bitcoin and then a few other chains that are relevant, with maybe a few other assets that are relevant, but much smaller around it. But ultimately your liquidity and your store value is still BTC.
Yeah, I think I agree with you guys on so many of these points. Like this idea that we could have kind of one financial system that is centered around one crypto asset or crypto network. I do think that could be possible, but on such a large time scale that we're not going to be around to see it. So, and then what Jameson was saying about people being able to transact in whatever cryptocurrency they want, and have the recipient receive it in whatever cryptocurrency they want. I could see that happening also. It would be kind of the equivalent of like, if you prefer using Signal app, but your friend prefers using WhatsApp, then the messages could be interoperable. Obviously, we're not there yet when it comes to communication, but anyway, all right. So I actually now want to just talk about the fact that throughout this conversation, we've just been talking about monetary maximalism, but we keep coming back to Bitcoin. So, and that is the second part of this title, the case for Bitcoin as a store of value. So obviously store of value means something that will, preserve its value, if not appreciate over time. And I did see a really nice definition online that was something that transfers purchasing power from the present to the future. So I just, wanted to say, if Bitcoin does become this good store of value and does appreciate more than it depreciates, then wouldn't that have a depressive effect on people's willingness to spend it? That's why we always talk about the guy who spent 10,000 Bitcoins on 2 pizzas 10 years ago, which, would have been $97 million today if he'd kept on it. So kept a hold of it. So do you think that it is possible to reach that vision where Bitcoin becomes, this one currency when we have this hurdle in place?
Speaking from personal experience, it certainly does. Now, on the flip side, I've still got to eat. I've still got to have shelter. I would say that the deflationary aspects and the potential long-term appreciation of value does dissuade me from purchasing things that I don't need. I'm not going out and buying Lamborghinis, for example, but I still do need to sustain myself and, eventually spend this money in one way or another. Now, we also get into some interesting maximalist philosophies around, whether Bitcoin is just something that you're thinking about as a medium-term investment. I've come into contact with a number of people who actually see it as a means of building multi-generational wealth. So there are certainly some people who take an extremely long-term view to this.
One of the things that I love about Bitcoin, and I don't know if everyone feels, I imagine many people don't, but it's been demonstrated to me through my career, is I do want consumerism to erode. So I don't think spending less money is bad. I actually think that we've been desperately out of whack. I think that through a combination of fiscal policy and just our culture, we love to buy things and throw them away. And there are all of these negative externalities that come from that. Obviously, there's environmental impact, but there's also just social impact where, at least in the US, I can't speak to the world, but in the US, there's a bit of a throwaway culture. And so for me, if Bitcoin wins and more people take on this saving and building mindset, fantastic. I think that's that would be a great societal improvement. In my personal life, I was not a wise saver at all growing up. And I think the first time I really started saving truly was like 24 or 25 when I got involved with Bitcoin. Now, I've definitely pulled a Laszlo. I've spent a lot of crypto, a lot of Bitcoin, particularly in my life. If you guys, when Fold first started, it was just about spinning Bitcoin. But I think that, since then, it's kind of, I've been infected by this like thought of building for the future, and it's kind of spread throughout my family. So multi-generational, I don't know if my view's quite that long yet. I would like to get there. I guess I do have kids in the other room, so technically it's multi-generational. But yeah, if we spend less money, great.
I also look at it as an entrepreneur. What service can I build? What can I offer to people that is of such value that they would be willing to part with their Bitcoin in exchange for it?
Huh. Well, it's funny that we went in this direction of consumerism and stuff, because I actually know that Jameson also is opposed to fractional reserve banking. And in a way, the concepts that, one is just applied to the personal sphere and one is applied, on a larger economic scale. But obviously, I'm sure you guys know that is also thought to be one of the main drivers of economic growth. So, what would you imagine the impact would be if we went to something like Bitcoin and people began to curb their spending? Or on the other hand, or if they were demanding proof of reserves, meaning that their Bitcoins were not being lent out.
Yeah, part of this, I think, is, what is the time value of money? We've seen some interesting research into that, at least with regard to Lightning Network as a second layer, because if you want to offer liquidity on there, you have to, quote unquote, lock up your Bitcoin for some period of time. This is perhaps getting to a more interesting question of like, can we build an economy where you really do have to provide value that is greater than whatever this time value of money actually is. And by that, I mean you holding on to money for a period of time, if that value isn't changing, what is that really getting you in terms of security? And what level of risk are you willing to take in order to increase that value? And perhaps the way that banks have been working with fractional reserve lending, with the ability to essentially create money out of thin air, perhaps that is actually the abnormal thing that is not following what we might consider to be natural economic laws, because they don't necessarily value money in the same way, since they can just create more of it.
Yeah, so I struggle with this. Frankly. But what it comes down to is anything that can be done with fractional reserve banking, anything that can be done by increasing the money supply can be done without it. It just requires people saying yes. So, for example, when the money supply is expanded, you have to look at who's harmed and then who gets the spoils. And I think that the funny thing about central planning is when it goes well, you don't complain. When it goes poorly, it wrecks economies. And so anyway, I guess my point is there will have to be changes to move away from fractional banking. There will have to be changes to kind of like wean ourselves off money printing. Maybe if we really think this is the way society should work, then maybe there's some sort of, gosh, and I would never want this as a libertarian, but maybe there's some sort of wealth tax. I don't know. But right now what's happening is, for an additional $1, that's printed or, however you want to think of it, created on a ledger, someone who's holding cash is being debased. And luckily for the US, we've been in this spot where that doesn't matter because there's still so much demand for USD that we're not seeing purchasing power get totally destroyed. But you start to see the edges of the system where you're like, okay, I'm told that there's no inflation. I'm told that everything is going great. But room and board, like cost of living, medicine, and education are incredibly expensive. And so you ask yourself, what are the things that you have to have in life? Well, a place to live and shelter, stuff to eat, basic medical care, and for a lot of us, education. So I would argue that a lot of the growth has been growth in special interests. It's been fueling inequality. And I don't actually think, I think that we can replace the system with something better.
I think it's also worth noting that Bitcoin doesn't actually prevent fractional reserve banking. We've seen it happen quite a few times already. The difference is that if you want to take the risk of running a fractional reserve, there's no one who's going to bail you out.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to ask also if that last line of questioning kind of goes into this sort of well-known money crypto versus tech crypto divide, where, I just see it as a journalist. Like, I'll interview people and I clearly can figure out, are they on the money crypto side or are they on the tech crypto side? And there are a few, and I would count Matt as one of them, where they're sort of both. But Matt is sort of like one of those few and far in between. So can you explain kind of what that is and how, and whether or not you feel like that is maybe why there would be like other people in the crypto community who, do feel like fractional reserve banking or
Sure.
offering credit is something that is helpful to the economy, and they don't understand this kind of money crypto side of Bitcoin. Or
So let me give the slightly optimistic response, which so putting my kind of both camps hat on for a little bit. So I think what I saw, and this is just my take on the space, is that all of us for a long time were Bitcoin. And, there were alts, but they never really built up the sort of fanaticism and almost religion that Bitcoin has. But there were these two competing visions, which was hard money, number one, and then maybe censorship resistance, but it's not number two. It might, I don't know what's in the middle, but it's not, it's a distant second. And then there's tech, which is, I don't want to call it Silicon Valley necessarily, because a lot of it is more renegade, but it's censorship resistance, and also maybe we can replace payments in the world, and sort of we can fix anything if we try hard enough. We just have to move fast and sometimes break things. So you have these two different extremes where there's sort of like a tech conservative, fiscally conservative side, and then there's this tech positive and then fiscally unclear side. And the Bitcoin, has already had this community split. So it actually, in my opinion, it happened before Bitcoin Cash. So that was the final nail in the coffin. The entire big block debate, ultimately, to me, it was really a debate about what matters. Is what matters to you, what's the best way to put it? Is what matters to you hard money, but also the ability to validate the properties of your hard money versus sort of like metrics and driving new use cases, which were sort of on the big block side. So we had this Bitcoin community split. Some people landed in Bitcoin Cash, some people before that landed in Ethereum. And what I've noticed is that a lot of the Bitcoiners end up being right anarchists, and then a lot of the Ethereum folks end up being left anarchists, and then people have kind of split all over the place. So I guess for me, I think those things are compatible because both sides are ultimately supporting individual liberty, and that's what I'm in this game for. And I've totally lost track of your question, Laura, but that's the beginning of my thoughts on this.
Well, it's funny because you did say that you didn't want to say Silicon Valley doesn't get Bitcoin. And yet, when we were going over what our talking points were, one of yours was why Silicon Valley doesn't get Bitcoin. So
Yeah,
I'm curious. Yeah, I do feel like
it's
that happened with that big block debate in Bitcoin, where it did feel like the entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley were more like, let's increase the block size and we'll just get more transactions on the network, because there's more users coming. And, the side that was like, this is money. They were like, no, 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 no. Like, we have other ways to do this. Like, to me, it did feel like one side was like Silicon Valley and then the other side was not,
for
frankly.
sure, for sure. And I think there's a little, what Silicon Valley's interesting brand of libertarianism is missing. It's missing guns. It's missing. There's just some physical practicality. I think that Silicon Valley style libertarianism tends to be very self-serving. So maybe like Uber is fantastic. We're capitalists, but then you skip all of the data collection and the things like that. And so there's a lot of cognitive dissonance when you get into it. And so for me, one of the things that Silicon Valley doesn't understand about Bitcoin is if you are a libertarian, but you're also really pragmatic and you're trying to make money, it is going to be more profitable to try to replace Bitcoin and to try to pick the next winner than it is to just support it. And so I think we've seen a time. The same thing has happened to Ethereum. There was just this slew of ETH killers who got an incredible amount of money. Maybe one of them will win, maybe, and those people will be fabulously wealthy. But I think there's a good chance that they won't, and it will have been a lot of free money that was given out and that is now gone.
I mean, this is why there are so many toxic Bitcoin maximalists. Is I think that they look at some of these projects that are going on and they just get exasperated because they're like, look at all of this potential effort that could be going towards trying to make Bitcoin better, but instead, we're competing because the temptation to print your own money is so high. But that is, I think, one of the great things about this whole space is that we have not taken away any power from governments and central banks. Rather, we have empowered everyone to print their own money. And, that does create a state of anarchy. It does create more competition. There are pros and cons to it. And I've struggled with the Silicon Valley stuff myself as an entrepreneur. I went through it once at my last employer, where we were just under a lot of pressure to add support for every cryptocurrency under the sun. And now I go through the same thing with my current company, where a lot of the Silicon Valley folks, they want to say, oh, you need to check all the boxes. You need to support the top 30 cryptocurrencies, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas I view what I'm building from a security standpoint, and I have finite resources. And if I'm not devoting them all to Bitcoin, then I am inevitably leaving something on the table where I'm not making the best Bitcoin experience possible for my users.
All right. Well, I think we need to start wrapping things up. But of course, we're in this moment in time where I think all of us realize that what's going on in the wider macroeconomic world really intersects with all these things we've been talking about in Bitcoin these last, I guess the last decade for, the people who have been in it since the beginning. And I just wonder what you think will happen in terms of how COVID and the stimulus response and, frankly, just all the uncertainty that's happened with, record unemployment and all this stuff, how that will intersect with what you guys are building in crypto.
So things could go incredibly well. That's a weird thing for me to say. I'm typically planning for everything to go sideways, and that's kind of my worldview. But this is how it is with central planning. Maybe the central planners had some insight, and maybe everything will go very well. But what I expect is going to happen is that as this feels less and less like an emergency, we're going to look at now who got how much money, and we're going to start questioning why was Main Street, to use political speech, why was Main Street given this much versus, the stock market given this much? And why has the stock market decoupled from the rest of the economy? And I think that, already, at least my generation has been seriously questioning the way of things. And even though probably all of the money printing in the US is better for the US, like it hurts the US hegemony, but it might help its citizens. I think pretty quickly we're going to be like, well, why did Bank X or Bank Y get all of these resources? And then, my local bank got nothing. So I expect there will be a backlash. I expect there's going to be, we're seeing a facet of it right now. And I also think that there's just a hangover, right? Where, after TARP and then after this event, things start to feel good. You start to have hope. And then you wake up and you look around and you see that the system has been changed a little bit and it might not be in your favor.
All I can really say is that the past few months have actually been really good for business. We have seen a new wave of people coming into the space. We've had a number of so-called no-coiners, who they're finally looking at diversifying their wealth for the first time to try to gain some additional protection against these factors that they haven't really considered as risks before now. So that combined with the issues around traveling, around restrictions on the economic standpoint, I think that has actually given people more time because they can't go out and live their lives to actually just sit down and look at the world around them and start to try to parse, exactly what's going on. And that may lead them to some interesting new conclusions.
Yeah, I'm actually not surprised to hear about that in terms of your company. And actually, maybe we should connect offline so I can learn more. Anyway, all right. Well, thanks, you guys. This has been such a great conversation. And I hope that we've got some of the audience interested in this stuff. And if so, where can they learn more about each of you and your companies?
Well, it's easy to find me. My Twitter handle is Lopp, Lopp, and the website for Casa is keys.casa.casa.
I do not have nearly so memorable a Twitter handle, but you can check out my latest work at tbtc.network, where we are bridging Bitcoin to Ethereum.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thanks to you both.
Thanks a lot, Laura.
Thanks.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.